Hey there folks, Wrel here. Today we're going to be doing a design and review of the NS-61 Emissary sidearm, an nanite system weapon available to all classes and all factions. We'll break down the stats, talk about its effectiveness, as well as what you can look forward to in the future. So the NS-61 is going to run you 1000 certs or close to 800 daybreak cash to unlock, and if you unlock it with daybreak cash, that's available to all your classes, all your characters. There's also a superiority pack in the depot that also unlocks all of the attachments as well. This is the first time that something like that has been done for a new weapon, to my knowledge. The design looks very similar to the Scorpion VZ61, and I was told that the sound design is actually inspired by the MAC-10 and the Scorpion itself. Originally, the weapon was going to be named the NS-93 Emissary because the first model that the weapon used internally reminded me of the Beretta 93R. The name Emissary is used because both the Commissioner and the Underboss are names that reflect individuals with authority, people in places of power. And at the same time, knowing what the niche of the weapon was going to fill, it didn't make sense to give it like sheriff or deputy or ambassador, one of those names that reflect too much power. And honestly, some of those remind me of NC more than anything else. As far as stats goes, the Emissary deals 112 damage at 15 meters and tapers out to 77 damage at 60 meters. The minimum range of this weapon is really long compared to most pistols, which means a lot of consistency out to that 15 meter mark, but the damage itself is very, very low. Within 15 meters, you're looking at a 9-shot kill and up to 13 shots to kill at its maximum damage range. The weapon has 25 rounds per magazine, or 30 rounds with extended magazines, which we're going to talk about later. But what this means is that, in theory, you can kill up to 3 targets in a single magazine with all body shots. The reality, though, is that we tend to miss shots, or that the enemy will be running nanoweave armor, or they'll have heavy shields up, etc., etc., so it's much more likely that you're going to be getting a single kill per magazine, or 2 if you're being conservative. The rate of fire is 577 rounds per minute, or 9.61 rounds per second, and if it takes 9 shots to kill a target, you're looking at 0.83 seconds theoretical time to kill within 15 meters. That's a very, very long time to kill compared to not only other secondaries, but weapons in general. And while the intention was that the weapon shouldn't perform as well as other secondaries up close, or as a panic sidearm, things are a little bit out of whack right now. But before we dig into that too much, let's go over the rest of the stats. We already talked about the 25 round magazine by default, with an extended magazine giving you 5 extra rounds, but it's also worth noting that the Emissary is the first pistol to have access to an extended magazine option. Hopefully that's something you'll see on more pistols in the future. The reload speed is 1.8 seconds short and 2.8 seconds long, and that's to offset the size of the magazine. It's fairly long for sidearms in general. The projectile velocity is 360 meters per second, which is roughly SMG tier, so nothing amazing about it. It's actually not too great. And it also has access to a suppressor, which is going to reduce its velocity by 12%. So that's down to 317-ish meters per second. If you're running a suppressor, you want to make sure that you're pretty close to your target because it also pulls at the maximum damage range, pulls it in by 5 meters, and pulls in the minimum damage range by 20 meters. This also makes the bullet drop really pronounced, so generally speaking, you don't want to run a suppressor unless you're using a stalker infiltrator, and even then, since you're using an NS weapon, it can be avoided a lot of times if the fight is bigger, because NS weapons are shared between all factions, and the audio profile can be confusing. When it comes to recoil, the Emissary is very, very accurate. This was meant to be the big offset to the low damage model, and for the most part it works, but you also can't expect new players to take advantage of chaining headshots, so like I said, it is a little bit out of whack. It has very low vertical recoil, a low first shot recoil multiplier, some slight left side pull, but you don't really notice it because the vertical recoil is so low. The horizontal tolerance, which basically dictates how many times a weapon can kick in one direction, left or right, before coming back to center, is actually a bit different for the aim down sights and the hip fire modes of the weapon. From the hip, it's 0.4, but while aiming down sights, it's 0.3, and that should mean that the weapon kicks up to 3 times in one direction from the hip, but only up to 2 times in one direction while aiming down sights. That's the first weapon to do this to my knowledge, but the point was to make hipfire just a little bit less accurate than its aim down sights, and all in all, given the cone of fire, you're probably not going to notice it anyway. Speaking of cone of fire, it's pretty small all around, and again that's because the damage model is very low, so the weapon kind of relies on it. Fun fact is that the ADS cone of fire bloom is half that of normal pistols at 0.05 opposed to 0.1. Another fun fact is that you don't usually notice the cone of fire bloom on most pistols because they tend to reset instantly, and since we oversample them, there's a short gap that most of the time we don't really notice. But with an automatic weapon, you're going to have to deal with the cone of fire bloom unless you're letting off the trigger to burst it. So it makes sense that it's lower in that respect as well. As far as attachments go, the Emissary has access to 1x and 2x reflex sights, a suppressor, extended mags, a laser sight as well as some cosmetic color laser sights if you want them, and a dark light flashlight. Because the recoil is so low, you can use a 2x reflex with practically no downsides, and as of making this video, the iron sights are super small, they aren't worth using in my opinion, and if you activate a heavy shield, you literally can't see anything down them. Like we mentioned earlier, a suppressor should only be used for close ranges and or when you're using a stalker cloak setup. The real decision is between extended magazines and laser sight. Laser sight is actually a lot more useful than I thought it was going to be given the damage model, and I tend to crutch on that for my stalker loadout. The extra 5 rounds from extended magazines is super useful if you're primarily aiming down sights, which ideally you'd want to be, and it'll also help you secure kills on targets further than 15 meters, further than your maximum damage range. I originally went into this thinking that extended magazines was going to be the flat out winner, but it turns out that both rail options are very viable in their own right. In regards to tactics, this is not a 1v1 weapon. It's passable if you can chain headshots, but more likely is that you want to work your range advantage, or you want to get the jump on unaware targets with Stalker Cloak. If you don't get an initiation on a target, then you need to dip back into cover and try to reset the engagement. This weapon isn't meant to be a finisher because of its low damage output. It's meant to function more closely to a close mid or mid-range primary, so it's best coupled with weapons that have niche roles, like shotguns or the archer or even long-range sniper rifles. Alright, now let's talk about some improvement things, some things that we can look forward to in the future. Like we mentioned before, the Emissary was designed to be a mid-range sidearm, something that's easy for new players to use, but not something that's going to replace your Commissioner for more skillful players. It was also not meant to be used as a finishing weapon in close quarters, or else it would just trump all of your available pistols, and that would make no sense at all. You can see that I'm holding my own well enough in these clips, but I also rely too much on headshots to maintain viability, not only in a 1v1 situation, but at range. It's very likely that you can empty an entire magazine and still not get a kill unless the target is preoccupied with something else or just isn't paying attention. Given that this weapon is specifically geared toward new players, it's too difficult to use well because of the low damage output. One possible solution is that if you increase the rate of fire of the weapon to 652 rounds per minute instead of the 577 it stands at right now, you can keep the same 112 damage model and end up with 1217 damage per second, which is up from its current 1077 damage per second. Higher rate of fire weapons are generally easier to use, especially at close range, and you'd retain the same shots to kill potential, which in turn retains the same potential numbers to kill per magazine. The weapon may also feel more like an automatic pistol then, just due to having a higher rate of fire, but the downsides are that it may also make the pistol feel less accurate or more difficult to control, which could compromise its effectiveness at longer range, which is where the weapon is supposed to find its niche in the first place. Another possible solution is that you could bump up its damage by a tier, so that it's sitting on 125 at 15 instead of 112 at 15, and you can also retain the same rate of fire then. That would reduce its shots to kill to 8 instead of 9, and it'll increase the damage per second from 1077 up to 1202. So very similar to the rate of fire buff that we mentioned earlier, at least in that respect. And for comparison, by the way, the Commissioner deals 1275 damage per second within 8 meters, and the Inquisitor deals 1266 damage per second within 10. So looking at the 1200 range in terms of damage per second isn't a bad idea as far as a weapon like this goes. It also needs to be balanced against its usability. So if you bumped up that damage model, the positives are that the weapon doesn't change its feel at all. Generally, you want to try to stay away from changing the feel or changing the role of the weapon when people have already spent their money on it, but that also shouldn't stop you from making necessary balance decisions. Another positive, or negative I guess, is that the number of headshots to kill would stay at 4, so the time to kill doesn't get any faster there, and that's helpful for keeping the weapon from becoming overpowered in the hands of more skillful players. The most powerful positive of that kind of change though is that it allows for more consistency, especially versus targets that are resistant in some respect, so they either have nanoweave or they have a shield, or targets that are slightly outside of your max damage range. There aren't a whole lot of downsides with bumping up the damage model, save that it could step on the toes of other weapons, for example the Emperor or the Rebel, both of which hover around the same effective range, and you could argue that the Emissary would flatly outclass them. Honestly though, that's more of a problem with those weapons than it is the Emissary itself, and hopefully they'll get a look in the future. That being said, the weapon right now doesn't quite match the reward for the required amount of skill. It's very close to where it needs to be, but it's not quite there yet, especially for newer players, or for players who can't aim all that well. If you still want to pick it up anyway, Stalker Cloak is probably the best way to make use of it right now, and it's also a whole lot of fun. If you're on the fence about whether or not to buy it, I would just wait until it gets a balance tweak, and then see what folks have to say afterwards. If this video has been interesting, helpful, or entertaining, please feel free to like, subscribe, tell your friends about the channel, and if you have any thoughts on the Emissary at the moment, feel free to share them in the comment section down below. Thanks very much folks, Wrel signing off.